As a teenager, he spent months saving pocket money to buy his own guitar. And today in the world, there are more than 100 models of guitars named in his honor. He was the leader of one of the most famous British bands of the 20th century, but decided to leave it at the peak of popularity. How did an ordinary school teacher become a music legend? Why did the Oscar-winning director film the birth of his child? And how did a dead psychiatrist help him write multi-platinum albums? You will learn about this and much more in today's video. You are watching the Enco Stories channel, and today we have the full story of Sting's life and work. Gordon Matthew Thomas Sumner was born on October 2, 1951 in the small port town of Wallsend, England. It is located on the banks of the River Tyne, where huge cruise ships and oil tankers were built and launched several decades ago. After the Second World War, the demand for ships fell significantly. The economic crisis struck, and the prosperous shipyard practically ceased to operate. Giant holes of unfinished ships blocked the sun for the entire area. Bad ecology, poor and damp houses, drunken unemployed citizens. That's what surrounded Sting all his childhood and youth. It's not surprising that the boy's main childhood impressions were precisely the unfriendly colors of his native city. The main colors of my childhood are black and gray. Black is the color of the coal that was mined, and gray is the color of the sea, which remains so even in sunny weather. I wouldn't want to go back to that past for anything in the world. His mother's name was Audrey. According to Gordon's early memories, she was incredibly thin, but just as incredibly beautiful. She dropped out of school when she was just 15 and almost immediately started working in a hair salon. Ernesto Sumner, Sting's father, served in Germany in the Army of Engineers. After returning to England, he met 18-year-old Audrey, whom he married almost immediately. Gordon's father worked as a mechanic at a machine-building plant, and his mother, after some time spent in a hair salon, retrained as a nurse. My earliest memory is also my earliest musical memory. I remember sitting at my mother's feet as she played the piano. She always played tangos for some reason. The piano was an upright with worn brass pedals, and when my mother played one of her tangos, she seemed to become transported to another world. She was 18 when Gordon, their first child, was born. Soon, almost one after the other, the boy had a brother, Phil, and two sisters, Angela and Anita. So children's cries were Gordon's constant companions. Audrey could not combine work with raising 4 children, so the father became the sole breadwinner of the family, who then received about £8 a week. It's not too much money, even for those times. They were not poor, but there was enough money only for food and clothes, which the children wore one after another. Due to money problems, the spouses constantly quarreled. Sometimes it came to fights. Those quarrels turned into a painful drama that lasted all their lives. When Gordon was 5 years old, his father quit the factory and decided to sell milk. This business was owned by his friend, who was going to retire and was looking for someone who could continue his business. His father was attracted by the fact that he could work for himself and his family could move to a spacious 2-story house on another street. The house where they lived before did not even have central heating. From the age of 7, Gordon began to help his father and worked equally with him. On weekends and during vacations, he woke up at 7 in the morning, helped carry milk crates, which he and his father delivered around the city. Of course, he hated that his brother could sleep in until lunch, but he liked being important. Sting remembers his father as being, quote, stoic with a lot of patience. When they worked together, Gordon always tried to impress him. He carried 6 bottles in his hands at the same time and 2 more under his arms. He memorized house numbers, the number of orders, and informed his father about all changes. His father took it for granted and never praised him, but this early work influenced the formation of discipline and future habits of the singer. Since then, I love cities in the morning, while there's no one on the street. Everyone's asleep and we quietly sneak up to the house like robbers. It seems that the streets belong to us alone and we feel their mystery, which according to my feelings, disappears with the appearance of the first passers-by. I still don't like to sleep late. I'm always the first to get up. Lying down is definitely not about me. The Sumner family had a strong religious tradition, and although Gordon's parents belonged to different confessions, the church played an important role in their lives. Separately, it's worth mentioning the grandparents on the mother's side, with whom Gordon spent no less time than with his parents. They lived in a house on the territory of a Catholic monastery, and a local priest often visited their house. In addition to religious texts, Grandma Agnes's library also contained a lot of fiction, and she was able to instill the love for books in her grandson. At the age of 7, she had him read Treasure Island by Robert Stevenson. The Adventures of Jim Hawkins made the boy distract himself from the gray surrounding reality, and he began reading constantly. As a result, Gordon grew up as a dreamy boy. At school, he studied mediocrely. but he was well-versed in English language and literature. Gordon attended St. Columba's Primary School, located in an old Victorian building next to the church where his parents got married. It was at this school that his relationship with religion became a rift that would last his whole life. Because of his tall height, his classmates called him Lurch from the Addams Family. Gordon took these taunts to heart, which made him even more withdrawn and distanced from his peers, preferring books. Despite this, he still had a company, and it consisted of problem children who already smoked, threw stones at windows, and stole food from stores. Gordon did not take part in thefts, but was often with them in the role of an outside observer. In childhood, his best friend was a boy named Tommy Thompson. He went to school when he wanted, already smoked pot, sold newspapers on the street, and did not believe in God. It's difficult to imagine a better example to follow. The only school subject that Gordon liked at school was singing. The students memorized folk, religious, and Christmas songs, which they sang in chorus to the accompaniment of the piano. It turned out that the boy had a good voice, but he would start developing it much later. Meanwhile, disaster was brewing at home. Although the life of the Sumner family at that time could hardly be called poor, sometimes there was not enough money at all, and his father's dairy empire often operated at zero or even at a loss. Once a blue truck drove up to our house, 4 men in gray overalls took my mother's piano from the second floor and loaded it into the car. Mom just watched and didn't say anything, but it seemed to me that something died in her soul. Gordon often missed classes at school because he helped his father deliver milk and his mother wrote notes for teachers. Sometimes he just didn't want to go there because of the bullying and boring classes, and Gordon easily convinced his mother to write another note like that. On days when they were alone with their mother, they listened to records, danced, watched passers-by from the window, and read books by the fireplace. In interviews and in his autobiography, Sting spoke of her as the closest person, but he also knew her secret, which almost destroyed their family. Despite his son's help, the father could not cope with the work alone, so he hired a man named Alan, who sometimes visited their home. One morning, Gordon woke up earlier than usual and heard strange noises coming from his parents' bedroom. His father was not at home, so he sneaked into the room, looked in there, and saw his mother in bed with Alan. Gordon didn't tell his father anything. He never told his mother about it either. But soon, Alan was fired. After that, silent tension and hatred began to grow between his parents, so Gordon mostly lived with his grandparents. I become withdrawn and closed in on myself. I think that I am to blame for the situation that has developed, but since I did not discuss it with anyone, there was simply no one to convince me otherwise. In the grandparents' house, there was a piano, which Gordon spent a lot of time playing. He did not know how to play, but he liked to make scary sounds by hitting the keys. Before that, he had already fallen in love with music, not least thanks to his mother, who brought rock and roll into their home. He got his first guitar from a friend of his father who immigrated to Canada and left some of his belongings at their house before leaving. Among them was an old acoustic guitar with 5 rusty strings. Gordon spent a lot of time in a shop called Bradford's Music Shop. His owner, Mr. Bradford, let him spend hours looking at the musical instruments, and it was he who helped Gordon replace the strings. Did you have a place in your childhood where you like to go alone? Tell us about it in the comments. In addition, Gordon bought a book to self-learn guitar. This would help him tune the old guitar and also give him an understanding of how to play chords and how to learn to read music from a music sheet. In 1962, Gordon was admitted to a high school in Newcastle. It was one of the most elite establishments in the city, which was not so easy to get into. Moreover, he also received a scholarship to study. Although it was not so easy to wait for gifts from his father that time, he gave him a new bicycle. Gordon shared his joy with his friend Tommy, but Tommy was not thrilled. Tommy didn't get accepted into high school, so to cheer him up, Gordon gave him a ride on his new bike. They drove around the city all day, said goodbye in the evening, and after that, their communication almost stopped. In parting, Tommy congratulated him on his new school and shook his hand. Almost 10 years later, already a college student, Gordon hears news about Tommy from his father. His old friend would come home from the pub, turn on the gas stove, but forget to light it and fall asleep. The next morning, he was found dead. The atmosphere in the house remained tense. The parents did not fight, but treated each other as if they were strangers. On Thursdays, his mother would get into the car, say that she was going to see a friend, but both Gordon and his father knew that this was not true. The Sumners remained a family by inertia mostly because of the children. Furthermore, they simply could not afford a divorce. In high school, Gordon again turned out to be higher than all his classmates, and because of that, he was once again insulted. But with age, his charisma and wit grew, so very quickly he assimilated and became their friend. If Gordon got used to fellow students quickly, he never got used to school rules. The school was run by priests, and beatings with sticks were most often used as punishments. During 1 year of study, I set a record for receiving a total of 42 very painful canings on the buttocks. I felt like I was being punished simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong expression on my face. Despite the outdated rules, the school really provided a good education. Already a year later, Gordon was conjugating Latin verbs, knew the basics of the French language, knew chemistry and physics well, and reread classical poetry and prose. According to his own words, this knowledge further distanced him from his parents because they could not help him with his homework. They were simple people who read no books, knew no languages but English, and had never been abroad. And although he really loved them and never blamed them, according to his own words, he turned into a terrible snob. His education became another obstacle between him and his parents, a kind of wall of theorems, books, philosophy, and languages. Although he studied well, music still remained the thing that interested him the most. Moreover, he mastered the old guitar quite well, but the more he practiced, the more he realized that he needed a new instrument. Almost every night after school, he would stop by Mr. Bradford's shop to see if anyone had bought the guitar he had been eyeing for himself. It was a beautiful instrument made of light wood with steel strings and an ivory fingerboard. So it hung above the window for several months until Gordon collected the sum of £16. This was a lot of money not only for the child but also for his parents. But nothing could stop the musician, who for the first time in his life really fell in love with the instrument. It was around that time that Gordon heard the Beatles for the first time. He was impressed not only by the music, which really sounded revolutionary, he was also inspired by the fact that the life circumstances of the members of the Liverpool Four were very similar to his own. Lennon and McCartney studied at a secondary classical school, and all the Beatles grew up in simple families in Liverpool, a port city similar to Newcastle. The Beatles conquered the world with songs they wrote themselves, and their success story inspired hope in a whole generation of musicians, including Gordon. He listened to the Beatles albums with the same attention with which he used to listen to Rodgers and Hammerstein. The only difference is that now he had his own guitar with which he could not only listen but also repeat their chords and riffs. I listened to individual difficult passages over and over again, like a bear cub breaking into a safe, until I solved their secret. No school subject takes up so much time and energy. I will not claim that I see my future in music, but there is something almost manic in my behavior. In the mid-1960s, the television program Top of the Pops, a hit parade which Gordon watched with religious enthusiasm, appeared on television. But his knowledge of pop music did not prepare him for the incredible shock he felt when he saw Jimi Hendrix perform on TV. Hendrix's performance on Top of the Pops in December 1966 changed not only Gordon's mind, but music in general. With his elegant and fierce guitar playing, he transformed the old folk song Hey Joe into the most powerful blues composition. A few days later, Hendrix was scheduled to play in Newcastle, and Gordon went to that concert, even though he wasn't even 16. Due to his height, he was not asked for documents. He remembered the concert for the virtuosity of the performance, the killer volume, the afro hairstyle, and the wild clothes of the musicians. At the end of the performance, Hendrix punched a hole in the plaster of the ceiling with the neck of the guitar. There were enough impressions for a lifetime. At the age of 16, Gordon met Keith Gallagher, who became his lifelong friend. It was Keith whom Gordon played his first songs to. Of course, they were not of the best quality, but Keith supported his endeavors and constantly advised him not to stop. Not so long ago, Keith reminded me that one of my earliest songs was about a flower in the desert. I had completely forgotten about this composition, and 35 years later I recorded the song Desert Rose, which sold more than 1 million copies. At the same time, Gordon began attending the Young Men's Christian Association, where he met two brothers, Ken and Pete Brigham. The brothers were equally obsessed with music, so a friendship developed almost immediately. Together, they learned the songs of their idols and played them endlessly. If they weren't rehearsing in the Young Men's Christian Association building, they were playing in Ken's bedroom, who lived in the attic of an old Victorian house by the sea. One night, Pete had a date scheduled, so he missed the rehearsal, and Gordon took over on bass. It was then that he first had an understanding of what a bass guitar is. He realized that the bass is not the most attractive instrument, but it is perfect for his character. Bass is a massive instrument and fits like a gun in the hand. In its entire appearance, you can see a restrained beauty. Bass is the basis of harmony, the basis on which the entire composition is built. Due to his passion for music and unwillingness to study, Gordon was unable to pass the final exams the first time. He had the opportunity to hand over the piled-up items, but the boy decided to take a 6-month break to think things through. After getting acquainted with the bass guitar, his musical ambitions first took shape in something comprehensible and understandable. For the next 6 months, Gordon changed job after job and tried to decide what to do next. For some time, he worked as a bus conductor, then got a job at a construction site. He spent several months there, but his colleagues constantly motivated him to find something better. After that, Gordon managed to get a job in the tax office. It was a good job, albeit boring, and its workers received government subsidies and paid much less for housing. During this time, he met and started dating a girl named Deborah. This was his first serious relationship, which, however, did not last too long. Soon, he would meet another girl, start cheating on Deborah, not daring to break off the relationship with her. 4 years later, Deborah would die in an accident, and thoughts of her death would accompany him throughout his life. In an interview in 2003, the musician called Deborah the first real girl. The song Walking in the Moon, one of the most popular in the repertoire of the Police, was dedicated to her. The name described the unforgettable feeling with which he left her house and went home. After working for 6 months in the tax office, Gordon entered teacher training college where he met Jerry Richardson. It happened during his first public appearance at a folk club when Gordon first appeared on stage and performed a song from the TV series MASH. Jerry Richardson played keyboards in a jazz band and was looking for a bass player. After the performance, they talked until the bar closed, then continued with a party at Jerry's apartment. That evening, they listened to Michael Davis, and Gordon did not even dare to dream that in the future he would participate in the recording of his album. But that evening, Gordon received an invitation to Jerry Richardson's band. The band was called Earthrise and performed jazz compositions. Despite the fact that, according to Sting's memories, they were quite good, it was not often possible to perform. Besides Jerry and Gordon, there were several other musicians in the band, as well as a soloist named Megan. Gordon was so in love that he even forgot to tell Deborah about Megan, and Megan about Deborah. The breakup with Deborah would be painful and scandalous. His mother tried several times to reconcile them, but nothing would come of it. Gordon had a new love and a new band. And if everything was going well in the new relationship with Megan, the band was not going through the best times and soon fell apart. Jerry Richardson left to seek a better fortune in London, but left Gordon with several contacts of bands looking for musicians. They were called Phoenix Jazzmen and Newcastle Big Band. The Newcastle Big Band was a moderately well-known band at the time, all members of which were at least a generation older than Gordon. At the audition, Gordon had to perform his part of the song Better Get Hit in Yo Soul by Charles Mingus, but he did not have time not only to play, but even to read notes. As soon as it was all over, I realized that I could pack up and leave. I heard the musicians muttering, "The guy didn't make it," and a nod in my direction, so I knew exactly who they were talking about. However, band leader Nigel Stanger praised his efforts, gave him another chance, and asked him to learn sheet music by next week. The first audition went horribly, but he was determined to live up to the trust, and a week later he did get a place in the orchestra. He played a few small concerts with them and then moved to Phoenix Jazzmen. Gordon was 21 years old, and he again turned out to be the youngest member of the team. It was here that Gordon got his new name, Sting. There are still legends surrounding the history of the appearance of the pseudonym, which Sting himself actively supports, not denying or confirming any of them. According to one version, it happened when he wore a black and yellow striped sweater to one of the performances. He was called Sting all evening, then continued the next day, and that's how the name stuck with him. According to another version, the band members dressed up as Chicago gangsters while playing in the evenings. When there were any problems with the fans, Sumner was pushed forwards with the words, "Kill them, Sting." According to the third version, Sting's nickname was invented by the drummer of a big band for his toxicity and irony in the addresses of colleagues in the band. And there's also a version that Sting got his nickname when a bee got into his trousers at a concert. One way or another, he got a new name, for which in the future he would still have to fight with a wrestler with the same name. This will be in the future, and for now, he and the band performed in small clubs in front of an audience of miners, locksmiths, and just random drinkers. They were making good progress, but the prospects for development were still dim. In the last year of his studies, Sting went to a teaching practice in a small town near London. There, he taught, walked a lot in the mountainous area, and wrote songs. On weekends, Gordon returned to Newcastle where he met with Megan, and on Saturdays, he played with Phoenix in small clubs. On Sunday, there were several more performances, after which he returned to practice again. It was successful, and after its completion, the young teacher was offered a permanent job at the school. It was a big disappointment that Megan not only grew cold towards him during this separation, but also cheated on him with a boyfriend from college. A few weeks later, she tried to apologize and come back, but Gordon didn't care. He was completely captivated by music. Balancing studies, rehearsals, and trying to survive, Gordon still got a job at St. Paul's Catholic School. He became the head of a class of 30 students, most of them children and grandchildren of miners. The children liked his teaching style, and he very quickly found a common language with them. Gordon read them fiction, played the guitar, taught folk songs, and even took the whole class with him to his own performances. Sometimes children were their only listeners. Simultaneously, every Wednesday, Gordon played in clubs with his new band Last Exit, which included several people from Phoenix Jazz and Jerry Richardson. Things were going well. Together with Jerry, they found a good apartment where they learned new compositions for their performances around the clock. Back then, they received not £5 per evening, but 60 per week. During one performance, Gordon met a woman named Frances Tomelty. She was an actress in a musical in which they also played, lived in London, and successfully starred in a TV series. At first, there was a spark between them, but let's say it didn't light up the sky. At least according to Frances's memories, she preferred the lead guitarist. However, at the premiere of the Christmas show, which took place on the day they met, Sting found an excuse to talk to Frances and charmed her with his charisma. A few days after their first meeting backstage at the university, Sting persuaded Frances to let him come over to play some of his latest compositions for her. It was a banal technique, but it worked. Frances recalled, quote, "It was like this. I made him cheese toasties while he serenaded me on the guitar." Teaching did not combine well with the life of a musician, especially since every Friday Gordon went to London where Frances lived. He spent 5 hours on the road, then was with his beloved for a whole day and returned on Monday morning half an hour before the start of classes. Sometimes Frances came alone. She went to their band's performances, gave advice on how to behave properly on stage and how to keep the audience's attention. She believed in what Gordon was doing and believed that the band would only benefit if the vocalist become a showman. Despite the fact that the group Last Exit is far from the best that happened to the music scene in Newcastle, they received an invitation to perform at a jazz festival in Spain. Besides them, such stars as Ella Fitzgerald and Dizzy Gillespie were supposed to perform there at that time. It was a real road trip because the road took several days. Everyone got there in different ways, but in the end, they managed to perform successfully. The next day, their photo appeared on the front page of the local newspaper. Thanks to this, the band was invited to a week-long tour in Bilbao. Everything went well there too, but during one performance it started to rain, which ruined part of their equipment, so they had to finish without a microphone and several instruments. Nevertheless, they returned to London happy, with valuable experience, and with one more important thought. That summer, I finally understood that the success of the group as well as my future with Frances was inextricably linked to London. In my head, Frances and the breakthrough of our band became one, and I imagined London as the place where those dreams would come true. The television series in which Frances played at the time was withdrawn. She started looking for a new project for herself as well as promoting their band. She had contacts, contacted music labels, and constantly met with representatives of the departments of finding new artists. Frances first charmed them with her charisma and then handed out tapes of Last Exit demos. A very important acquaintance for Sting took place in a Newcastle club. Then he met an American named Stuart Copeland, who played drums in the band Curved Air. He praised their performance and left his number, saying that if Sting was in London, he should visit him. He would go, but after a few months. Last Exit demos had been floating around from label to label, and some of them had sent their people to see the band on stage in Newcastle. But neither the song nor the drive, nor the passion and virtuosity of the performance impressed them. At the same time, Gordon found out that Frances was pregnant. The only company interested in the band was the young music publishing house Virgin Publishing. In the future, it will become a mega empire, but it all started quite modestly. They liked the song I Burn For You, which Sting wrote for Frances. The representatives invited the band to the studio where they immediately recorded 10 songs in a few hours. The first performance was the same as in concerts, but there was a lack of experience. The record came out undersaturated and weak, but at the same time, they made it honest and energetic. The sound engineer was surprised that so many tracks could be recorded in such a short period of time. Deep in my heart, there's a whole world that's turning. The next day, they learned 2 pieces of news. The label offered them a contract for music and lyrics, but on the condition that the authors and the publishers split the royalties received for the songs in half. After consulting a lawyer who was paid £20, the band decided to sign their first contract, under which they literally gave up half of all future income. It was impossible to think of a worse deal, but none of them believed that they would earn even that £20 they spent on the lawyer. On May 1st, 1976, Sting married Frances Tomelty, and 6 months later, their first son, Joseph, was born. The wedding was modest. and there was no honeymoon at all. Looking ahead, we'd like to say that this marriage would not be happy and would last only a few years. In 1982, their daughter, Kate, was born, and with her birth, the marriage officially ended. Despite the fact that Sting promised himself a better family life than his parents, it never happened. At least he didn't succeed on the first try. At the end of the school year, Gordon quit school and spent the whole summer with the band on the Oriana cruise ship. 3 times a day throughout the cruise, they played during dinners, celebrations, discos, and parties. This job made it possible to earn extra money to move to London, but also Sting promised himself that the next time he played on a ship, it would be his own ship. In 1977, Gordon finally moved to London. He did not have a full-time job at the same time. He had a young son and a wife who could not work because of the child. They lived in a small guest room where the young family was allowed to live by their friend Francis. While the rest of the band were in Newcastle and just about to move to London, Sting was looking for an apartment and a job. In order to rent his own accommodation, he had to lie that he was not a musician but an employee of the label who was responsible for copyright and earned £5,000 a year. In fact, he stood in line every week to get his unemployment benefits. One day, when Sting was driving to get his money, he saw a black Bentley in the parking lot with Paul Cook, the drummer of the Sex Pistols, sticking his head out of the window. The rest of the band stood by the car, dressed in expensive leather pants and nonchalantly drinking beer. I like the Pistols. I absolutely do not envy them. The only thing that upset me a little is that I had to live on unemployment benefits, not them. A month later, other members of the band arrived in London, where they were to have their first concert. The performance was almost cancelled because the owners of the club messed something up and put several musicians on the same date. Besides, his friends had nowhere to stay. When he brought them to his new apartment, it turned out that the owner had learned the truth about his financial situation and had changed the locks in advance. Nevertheless, they still managed to perform, but the next day the guys still returned to Newcastle. Sting had no plans to return. He had no other choice. It was in a moment of near desperation when things didn't go as planned that Sting remembered that American drummer's number. He called him from the street phone booth, and the drummer invited him to visit. When Sting walked into the room, he saw Stuart Copeland sitting behind a massive drum kit, smiling and continuing to play. They exchanged a few words, then Stuart said, "Take the bass guitar. Let's play together." From the first second, it becomes clear that we have something in common. There is mutual understanding and connection between us. We're like two dancers who have found an unexpected mutual harmony, two lovers who have entered into the rhythm of passion. And I suddenly realize that this guy is the best drummer I've ever worked with. So they played for more than an hour, after which Sting realized that he had already joined a new band, which was to be called The Police. To prove his serious intentions, Stewart showed an article dedicated to him in the magazine Sounds. The photo in the magazine showed him sitting behind a huge drum kit with a quote from a fan at the bottom. Who was this cool new drummer in the band Curved Air? The most interesting thing is that no fan existed. It was Stewart who sent his photo there and asked the question. Sting realized that it was necessary to keep close to such a person. A few days later, Sting and his young son came to Stewart again, where he met Henry Padovani, the future guitarist of their band. Henry was from Corsica, spoke English poorly, and played the guitar even worse. He only knew a few chords, but he really wanted to play in a band. Sting, who strived for perfection even in those distant days, was quick to calculate the flaws. Henry was a ballast. I couldn't write a guitar part for him because he couldn't play the way I liked. He had intuition and spirit, but he didn't suit me. Actually, this is how the history of the band The Police began. With this composition, they recorded the first 2 songs, Nothing Achieving and Fallout, released the record with their own funds, and began to independently promote it in music stores. The band would not have succeeded if not for Miles Copeland, Stewart's older brother who would later become their manager. At the time, he was just beginning to recover from a major setback in the music business. He had a modest office, and at that time, he was the manager of the bands Chelsea and Cortinas. Miles was initially skeptical of the music they played, but his opinion improved when he heard their first single. Of course, not enough to offer the services of a manager, but he at least allowed the use of the phone in his office. The longer Gordon played with the new band, the more guilty he felt about the old one. He didn't like the music they were playing with the Police, but the news from Newcastle wasn't encouraging either. The former members did not want to move to London, and it seemed that the band Last Exit ceased to exist. Actually, That's how it was. Sting and Stewart were constantly angry with Henry, so they spent a lot of time training him. Henry was a good guy, but he clearly wasn't pulling the load, and they didn't have time to wait for his progress. But even with a problem in the form of a guitarist, about 10 songs appeared in the repertoire of the Police, 9 of which were written by Stewart. There was no talk of releasing an album yet, but they already had a 10-minute set which could already be performed as the opening act. For Frances, Sting's wife, the year was not easy either. They could not find housing for a long time. She was exhausted with a small child and could not return to work. When she was offered a role in the series The Survivors from the BBC, she immediately agreed. Not that she dreamed of this role, but even before the start of filming, the couple began to dream about what they would spend the future salary on. Then they rented a cramped apartment in the basement because they could not afford a better one. For some time, they had to fight with the neighbors who started leaving garbage near their windows. One day, Sting went to the neighbors to express his displeasure, but instead met a woman there who would become his mistress, and later his wife a few years later. Her name was Trudy Styler. Then she lived with her boyfriend and dreamed of becoming an actress. Her journey in London began extremely difficult. She ran away from home, and on the first evening she had to knock on the doors of strangers so that they would let her in to warm up. The young woman was invited by a family who later offered her to become their children's nanny. Then, with their support, she successfully entered a theater school, after which she received several leading roles in theater productions. I didn't want to follow my mother's path, who got into a difficult situation due to a conflict between family duty and love. But gradually, I fell in love with our neighbor, and the ground began to slip from under my feet. He was constantly haunted by guilt for not seeing his parents, for falling in love with another woman, and for essentially betraying his former band. To make up for at least one thing, he invited his old friend Jerry over to Stewart's house. They played there for a few hours, and then Sting tried to convince Stewart to take Jerry into the band. He didn't even want to listen and said that if someone had to be changed, it was their guitarist, Henry. Later, Jerry called Sting and offered a good job. He was called to play bass guitar in another band and was promised £100 a week. It was a lot of money for Sting, but he refused because he didn't want to betray another band. He stayed with the Police, although he understood that even such money was unlikely for them. In the meantime, there was an important acquaintance with Andy Summers, the guitarist who would become a new member of their band and replace Henry Padovani. He impressed them with his performance, and everyone realized that he was exactly what they were missing. Together, they wrote several new songs, released 50 records, and went to play in Newcastle. The manager saw to it that their posters hung all over the city, but after the concert, they managed to sell only 4 records. Success was local and less than modest, but they were increasingly invited to festivals, certainly not as headliners. So they visited France, performed in Paris and Colmar. They were well perceived, sometimes even better than the main stars of the evening. So far, they were playing as a foursome, but guitarist Henry knew he wasn't there for long. After returning to London, the guys made a difficult decision and finally replaced Henry Padovani with Andy Summers. This lineup would no longer change. The new trio debuted at Birmingham's Rebecca Club on August 18, 1977. Although it was not an easy decision, everyone was very encouraged by the fact that Andy was now finally with them. Sting started writing songs again, most of which would be included in the first album. He mainly rewrote old compositions, but there were also new texts. For example, one of the most famous hits, Roxanne. It was written in France when their band spent the night in a hostel near the train station. In the dirty lobby, Sting saw a poster for the play Cyrano de Bergerac. According to the play, this is a tragic clown whose curse is his own pride. This person has the gift of eloquence and an incredible sense of humor. Without showing his face, he makes a young girl fall in love with him, but he does all this for his friend. This friend dies, but Cyrano still does not dare to show himself to the girl. This girl's name is Roxanne. That evening, Sting went up to his room and wrote the lyrics to the song, songs that were destined to change his whole life.
Those days are over. You don't have to share your body to the night.
Festivals and concerts allowed rent to be paid several months in advance, so Sting felt better financially. Moreover, Frances got casted more and more often and even got the main role in the film, which marked her final return to the cinema. Since Sting still did not have a steady income, he appeared in commercials from time to time. As a band, they appeared in a chewing gum commercial, which greatly helped in their promotion. In that video, they bleached their hair to match the Snow White smile, which seemed to be helped by chewing gum. Later, blonde hair became one of the band's hallmarks. In addition, Miles Copland agreed to release their first album on his label. He still didn't fully believe in their abilities, but Miles needed to increase the number of clients in order to be taken seriously in the music business again. The first album was recorded in 10 days, and Miles paid the band members less than £100. They were writing on an old tape found in Copland's garage, and first they had to erase some other band's recordings from it. Despite those small prospects, the Police were still over the moon with happiness at the thought that they were writing an album. The main songs were recorded in the first days of work: So Lonely, Dead End Job, Hole in My Life, and of course, Roxanne. Initially, the album was to be called Police Brutality. The first cover looked something like this: the band members dressed as police officers taunting a half-naked beauty. Everyone but Sting liked this version, and he managed to convince his colleagues that it was the stupidest idea in the world. Miles Copland was the first to listen to the album and literally went from the studio to the A&M Records office. A few days later, he brought them a contract for the single Roxanne and a new title for the album, Outlandos d'Amour, i.e., Overseas Love. In March 1978, the Police signed a contract in A&M's posh office. After the agreement, everyone was allowed to go down to the office archive and choose any gifts there. Sting amassed a 200-pound collection of old records. Sting returned home victorious, told his wife the good news, and she responded in kind. She was offered a big role in the series, but the filming was to take place in Manchester. They were both ambitious, young, and both of them finally had something going on. Meanwhile, something very strange was happening at home in Newcastle. His mother and her daughter packed things and ran away from home without even leaving a note. They moved to Manchester to live with the same Alan. But after a few years, she would return, humiliated and sick. They would not be able to start a new life with Alan, and their relationship with the ex-husband would be ruined forever. Although Roxanne's song failed to chart high, the label gave the band another chance. They didn't want to release their record until one of the songs became a hit. Miles seriously thought about sending the Police with concerts in the United States, but it was a huge risk. Their popularity would not be enough for full halls, so they would have to perform almost for food. Regardless of any circumstances, touring the US is a dream for any musician. But first, you have to make money. Sting never studied acting and had no dreams of acting, but in the late 70s, he got a few small roles. The first was in the film Sex Pistols, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. He was offered the role of a musician of the gay rock group Blow Waves, which tries to kidnap the drummer of Sex Pistols, Paul Cook, the same guy that Sting saw in the Black Bentley. No one knows how Sting played in that movie, as all the scenes with him were cut, but he received £125 for filming. The second film was more successful and was called Radio On. There, Sting played the role of a boy obsessed with the tragic death of Eddie Cochran, the pioneer of rock and roll. And although art critics praised this film, the general audience completely ignored it. But its release coincided with the first wave of popularity of his band, so it helped both the film and Sting himself. His participation in the film Quadrophenia was a really good experience. Filming was to take place in Brighton in the US, which allowed both filming and performances. So in the evenings, Sting gave concerts, and in the morning he woke up with a hangover and went to the set. Do you have favorite movies where musicians play the main roles? Share the names in the comments. During the following months, the Police played in bars located between Miami and Montreal, as well as on the West Coast from Vancouver to San Diego. They were performed in the same way for an audience of 6 or 600 people. It can be said that they marked their territory ledge after ledge and city after city, and although many promoters and club owners have lost money invested in their performances, soon they will all be begging them to return. Sometimes there were from 5 to 25 people at the concerts. They say that Sting came off the stage, got to know the audience, and persuaded them to listen to the concert to the end. There's also a legend that he earned about $10 for the entire tour. This seems to be true, as the singer's autobiography includes a memory of how he was sitting in an American coffee shop towards the end of the tour and a waitress came over to refill his coffee. Sting covered the cup with his hand and said he didn't have the money for it. Then the woman smiled and said, quote, "Sunshine, I don't know where you came from, but the second cup of coffee is always free." The first appearance of the Police on television took place in October 1978. However, it was a little spoiled. Sting managed to spray himself in the face and had to go on stage wearing Stewart's dark glasses. He looked absolutely ridiculous, but Sting was pleased with his performance on the show because many of his pals in Newcastle saw him on TV. And if the first tour of the USA was a kind of pen test, the next year they decided to go repeat it but on a larger scale. Moreover, genuine interest arose in some of their songs. They began to climb the charts, so Miles organized 30 more performances in the United States. A&M Records also began to sense that British interest was growing and re-released Roxanne on April 12, 1979. When the band returned for a short vacation from America, Roxanne was already in the top 30 and they were invited to participate in the Top of the Pops program, the same one where Sting saw Hendrix perform for the first time.
I guess you'd call it suicide, but I'm too full.
Shortly after returning to Britain, A&M Records released Outlandos d'Amour. Sales eventually exceeded 100,000 copies, and the Police headed to Europe with concerts. In less than a year, the band, which was just making a living, turned into a leading one. In 1979, the Police sold 5 million singles and 2 million album copies. The Quadrophenia movie appeared on big screens around the same time, and the gangster type stuck to Sting. Much was written about his role in the press. Probably the fame of the rock star sparked interest. The reality was that he was on the screen, quote, long enough to make an impression, but not too long to be disappointed. However, the essence of the ratings did not matter to the producers of the film. Sting became the face that promoted the film on posters, on television, and on the front pages of newspapers and magazines. The mass media immediately recognized his appeal, and he became the center of their attention. The rest of the band was pushed into the background, while Sting was talked about by everyone and everywhere. Perhaps this became one of the reasons for the future breakup of the band, but the remaining members constantly said that they were completely satisfied with this situation. While Sting was the central figure of all talk shows and tabloids, Stewart and Andy lived a completely stable and calm life. After going on a huge tour, the band took a break, but not Sting. He had 5 film offers on his table, and he chose the main role in the film Artemis 81. Sting wasn't promised big fees for this role, but that didn't really bother him. He wanted to try himself in a dramatic role, for which he even refused the role of the main villain in the James Bond film. In addition, one of the scenes made the singer's buttocks known to the whole world. In one of the scenes, he was swimming naked in the lake, and after a few days, those shots were in all tabloids. Basically, Sting in the early 80s was a favorite subject of the press. He gave candid interviews and was not shy about talking on intimate topics. For example, once in a conversation with a young journalist, the singer said that he had to make love at least once a night. That came as a surprise to his wife, Frances, as he spent at least 6 months of the year away from home. If God has anything better to offer than sex, he's certainly saving it for himself. Feeling that the fame was focused mainly on him, Sting began to realize that the time would soon come when he would have to leave the band. Sting openly criticized the other 2 members of the band and even refused to perform songs he did not write. Sometimes he even called Stewart and Andy bad musicians. Even then, the Police was making $10 million a year, but he still thought the band wouldn't last long. Sting was not shy about saying that as long as the band was good for his career, he would not leave it. As soon as the situation changed, he would disappear as suddenly as he'd appeared. And what do you think? Is this the right thing to do, or is it an ordinary manifestation of star sickness? Write in the comments what you think. In April 1982, on the eve of the performance in the Midlands, Frances gave birth to a second child, Fuchsia Catherine, or simply Kate. The birth of the child was overshadowed by the fact that the day before, Frances finally found out that Sting had been dating her friend, Trudy Styler, behind her back. The love story with Frances was over. At first, Sting pretended that nothing had happened, and a few days later he was seen in a nightclub with Trudy. They held hands, and Sting introduced her as his lover. For the next few weeks, the press savored all the details of Sting's personal drama, which would greatly affect his reputation. On the professional side, things got worse for Sting too. The first big performance in his hometown of Newcastle turned out to be a failure, and there were only 12,000 people instead of 30. While Sting was trying to curb his depression, the movie Brimstone and Treacle was released. Its content raised certain questions, given that Sting played a perverted young man. But the main thing in the picture was the soundtrack. Sting wrote 6 solo compositions. Yes, the Police were still together at that time, but Sting began to do something separately from the band. One of the songs, Spread a Little Happiness, was released as Sting's first solo single. It contributed to the birth of a new wave of rumors about the future breakup of the Police.
What's the use of worrying and feeling blue when days are long? Keep on smiling through.
Trudy supported Sting at this point, but when he started to take his anger out on her, she just left. In this way, she made it clear that she would not allow herself to be treated like this, and Sting learned this lesson. From the mid-80s until today, they have been a happy married couple. The ex-wife got a spacious house in Hampstead after the divorce, and their 2 children also stayed with her. Having recovered from the divorce and not wanting to destroy the band, Sting, together with the Police, released the album Synchronicity. It was written during the process of divorce and starting a new life with Trudy, which was felt in its mood. The title of the album refers to Jung's concept of synchronization. Sting was convinced that the psychiatrist's idea of a collective consciousness fully reflected the working relationship of the 3 members of the Police. The works of this psychiatrist still play an important role in Sting's work. Then there was another important movie role. Sting was offered to play one of the villains in David Lynch's Dune. Incredibly long filming in Mexico was exhausting, but gave important experience of working with a cult director. Ahead was an equally exhausting tour of the USA, after which Sting finally realized that if he had to continue his career, then only solo. Sting was torn between 2 professions and canceled concerts for filming and turned down big roles for concerts. In the summer of 1983, the great stadium tour The Police began, which became the crown of their fame and the beginning of the end. And although the tour was legendary in its scope, contradictions and fatigue only increased. Rumors about the breakup of the Police intensified, and their manager even had to make a statement that it was just gossip. That had the opposite effect. It was obvious to everyone that a split was just around the corner. All I wanted to see and hear on the record was my own songs. I thought the best the band could do was Behind. And if from the outside it seemed that the musicians were enjoying their well-deserved fame, the tension between them was so big that before one concert, Sting even fought with Stewart, and he broke Sting's rib. The last few weeks of 1983 and the beginning of the following year was a time of big shows in Britain before another trip to the United States and then Australia. At this time, it was obvious to everyone that they were watching the last days of the Police. Rumor has it that it was this admiration for Young's work that led Sting to leave the Police and pursue a solo career. One day, when he was sunbathing on the beaches of Barbados, he had a dream. 4 hypertrophied blue turtles invaded the musician's garden and started a riot. They destroyed everything they could touch. Sting himself was running next to them in a dream, cheering and helping them with the destruction. After waking up, Sting realized that the blue turtles are a manifestation of his dark side, which, according to Jung's concept, is present in any artist. In this way, the Turtles suggested that it's necessary to direct the demons in the right direction. And in 1984, at the peak of the popularity of the Police, Sting left the band. Instead, he hired little-known jazz musicians and recorded his debut solo album, which was called The Dream of the Blue Turtles. Throughout this period, constant denials about the disbandment of the Police continued to appear, but the farewell tour put everything in its place. The birth of Sting's 3rd child did not particularly emphasize his reputation as a caring father. He actually missed the birth because he popped out of the hospital for a minute to buy something to eat. The child turned out to be a healthy girl who was named Bridget Michael, or simply Mickey. In 1985, Sting embarked on a major world tour in support of his first album. Not only his wife, who was pregnant again, but also a television documentary camera crew went with him. They were supposed to film a new phase of Sting's career. Everything was complicated by the fact that Trudy was 9 months pregnant, and already at the first concert she began to feel contractions. While Sting performed, Trudy was looked after by a team of obstetricians. Sting, who had managed to miss the birth of all of his previous children, was determined to see things for himself this time. It was because of this that he took Trudy with him on tour. The contractions turned out to be serious, and within a few hours, Trudy was taken to the delivery room. 12 hours later, Sting's 4th child, named Jake, was born. Sting not only did not miss the birth of his son, he even forced a camera crew to film this moment. The 90-minute documentary was called Born in the Night and was directed by Oscar-winning director Michael Apted. We will not show the moment of the child's appearance, but the film is definitely worth watching.
What did seeing your son born mean to you?
More than I thought it would.
When Sting was asked about what kind of father he was, he replied that in terms of upbringing, he was inspired by the way he was raised by his own parents, since they gave their son a certain freedom and independence, and instilled discipline and love for work. He was guided by the same principles. My children are very independent. They don't sit around and wait for a handout at all, and I wouldn't want to deprive them of this life adventure to earn a living on their own. It's a beautiful and difficult thing. That's why I didn't promise them anything. After the birth of his son, Sting began to confess his sins to journalists. He confirmed that he used addictive substances, cheated on loved ones, and insisted that, quote, friendship with the dark side was useful for his creativity. In September 1985, Sting almost died in an accident. He was scuba diving near Barbados and didn't notice how he ran out of oxygen. Only the selfless help of the instructor saved him from death. Sting was at a depth of 60 feet when his tank ran out of air. The arrows showed that everything was in order, but the oxygen was not flowing, and he began to suffocate. Unable to surface, he desperately swam towards his instructor and grabbed her ankles. Fortunately, she immediately realized what had happened, shared the oxygen, and brought him to the surface. Shortly after this incident, Sting learned that both of his parents had been suffering from cancer for several years. The mother's illness progressed more severely, and she had much less time to live. Despite the different periods in their relationship, they were always close with their mother. Audrey always appeared at her son's concerts in Newcastle and was extremely proud of her son's achievements. The illness of his parents was a double blow for Sting. Sting went to Newcastle for Christmas. Mother was in worse condition than father. Ernesto went to the hospital on his own, and his mother did not get out of bed. Sting tried to help, looked for the best doctors, but the future of his parents did not depend on him at all. In mid-1987, Sting released his second solo album, Nothing Like the Sun. It was written in 3 months in his New York apartment. All this time, he maintained close contact with his family in Newcastle and tried to continue his work, but it was not easy to concentrate on creativity. When writing, he set a grueling schedule for himself. Training in the gym, which was immediately followed by rehearsals and writing new songs. He also had time to play the piano and attend a dance class. Apparently, that's how the singer tried to drown out thoughts about the tragedy that unfolded in his family. Sting was recording a new album when his mother Audrey died. She fought the disease for 2 years, never lost her characteristic sense of humor, and in the eyes of Sting, she remained a brilliant woman until the very end. A few years later, the singer wrote The Lazarus Heart, dedicated to his mother. Soon after his mother's death, the father also died, losing his own fight. Sting was not present at their funeral because he did not want the press to make another story out of his grief. Sting will dedicate the next album, called The Soul Cages, to his father. During this period, Sting became a much more serious artist. He turned into songs dedicated to musicians who had passed away. Dramatic events in America and Chile and in the life of the singer himself later also became poems and then compositions. It was then that he received the Order of the British Empire for his outstanding contribution to the arts and many other awards, and it was then that he began to be called a legend. In August 1990, Sting's 5th child was born, daughter Elliot Paulina. Sting married Trudy only 2 years later. During the recording of his album, 10 Summoners' Tales, Sting began to realize that something had happened to his hearing. Wherever he was, he could hear the birds singing and chirping in his head, which made it quite difficult to create music. Doctors diagnosed tinnitus. That is, a condition where a person constantly hears sounds that are not really there. Because of this, Sting had to undergo a 3-week course of treatment, which included listening to Mozart's music through specially tuned headphones. They carefully filtered the frequencies so that the brain could relearn how to perceive sounds. Despite the problems with the most important organ in the musician's life, it was during this period that Sting wrote one of his most famous compositions. Perhaps you have guessed which song we are talking about.
That's not the shape of my heart.
Shape of My Heart was written with the participation of guitarist Dominic Miller. When they first met, Dominic was so nervous that he forgot to plug in his guitar, and for a while he couldn't figure out why it wasn't making any sounds. Then Sting came over and fixed the situation with one button. Since then, they've been working and performing together. It was Miller who brought Sting the motif that later became the song Shape of My Heart. Sting almost always writes the lyrics after the music because even without words, the music tells a story by itself. This song was inspired by the story of a card player who played not for money, but to figure out how chance and fate work. Despite the fact that hearing problems still bothered Sting during the recordings of this album, he could not stop touring. The music industry does not forgive long hiatuses, and sales always decrease if a musician does not perform live. Paranoia about cancer was also added to the hearing problems. He was afraid that the disease that killed his parents would eventually take him, so he had blood tests done almost every few months. At this time, Sting also started practicing yoga, which was recommended to him by Dominic Miller. From the age of 40 to this day, Sting regularly practices yoga and believes that these practices have extended not only his career, but also his life by decades. In addition, yoga strongly influenced his attitude to the world around him. Most of the highly social songs are the result of his reflections and attempts to reach those who tried not to notice injustice and cruelty. The best example is Sting's song, They Dance Alone. It was born after the bloody dictator Augusto Pinochet came to power in Chile. Any opposition was banned, and thousands of people disappeared all over the country. Relatives of these people went out into the street with portraits of the lost and began to dance cueca, a traditional Chilean dance. It was the only possible form of protest.
Dancing with their fathers, dancing with their sons.
Pinochet did not suffer any punishment, did not answer for his crimes, and died by his own death in 2006. Finally, after therapy, the hearing problems disappeared, so Sting returned to albums and was quite productive in the late 90s. By the end of the millennium, he released 3 more solo albums which were platinum and brought him Grammy statuettes, of which he has a total of 17. In the summer of 1995, Sting testified in court against his accountant, whom the singer accused of stealing his income. It was a sum of £7 million, which was a third of all the singer's savings. As a result of the trial, accountant Keith Moore was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Meanwhile, the family was waiting for a new addition. On December 17th of the same year, Trudy gave birth to Sting's 3rd son, who was named Giacomo. In the late 90s, Sting also landed a small role in the debut feature film of the then little-known Guy Ritchie. The British crime drama, Cards, Money, 2 Barrels, would never have been released if not for Trudy Styler. She used her connections in the industry to secure the rights to the music featured in the film. The movie received several prestigious awards and became a cult classic. In general, Sting can brag of quite a large number of film roles. His fame as a musician, as well as his appearance, have always attracted producers from the film industry. Having success in music, Sting did not have to act in everything in a row, so all his roles were a conscious choice. Of course, most often it was just a cameo where he played himself, but there were examples such as Dune, Quadrophenia, or a movie by Guy Ritchie. Becoming a Hollywood star was never part of the singer's plans, he just wanted to be a better actor. When the movie Julia and Julia failed and was crushed by critics, Sting was not too upset. The failure of the movie did not affect the number of people at his concerts. As you know, turning a rock star into a movie star is not easy. Some of rock's most influential and charismatic artists, including Mick Jagger, David Bowie, Madonna, and Bob Dylan, have attempted it, but the results have not been inspiring. In this regard, Sting showed considerable perseverance and was filmed again and again, even after failures. I've been in good films, bad films, and indifferent films. I've performed well, badly, and indifferently, but the people in the industry are aware that there is a seriousness about my work. They know that I'm not just cashing in on fame. The 5th album, Mercury Falling, was not as well received as the previous few, but it was still enough to satisfy the fans and appease the press. The title track from his new album, Brand New Day, proved that Sting can still deliver hits. The song reached number 13 in the UK charts, and the record also won 2 Grammy Awards. Many years later, reflecting on his evolution as a songwriter, he would say that over time, he began to understand harmony more than before, more about harmonic structure and how to modulate keys, which is all technical stuff. So Sting seems to be more adept at moving parts of songs around now than he used to be. But there's something about being a young musician, a young songwriter. It's just kind of balls to the walls, let's go for it. He adds, that energy is something that you can't discount. But I'm 71 now, so my music has to reflect who I am, so I'm not desperately trying to get on the K-pop charts. The release of the next record, All This Time, coincided with a tragic day in the history of the United States, as it was released on September 11, 2001. This album was dedicated to all the people who lost their lives on that day. I think there's a common thing going on with humans. All of us, regardless of nationality or creed, are directly connected to the same energy that holds our world together. Sting took the name of this energy in the title of his new album, Sacred Love, recorded in the first half of 2003 in Paris. The album bears a distinct imprint of the events in the world that were happening at that time. Sting's lyrics touch on war and religion, but the main theme, as you might guess from the album's title, was still love. The song Send Your Love from this album brought Sting another Grammy nomination. In the same year, Sting was inducted into the Hall of Fame.
This is the time of the world colliding. This is the time of kingdoms falling. This is the time of the world divided.
Although back in the 80s, Sting confidently declared that the history of the Police was ended forever, in 2007 there was a reunion. Reunited, they opened the Grammys where they performed Roxanne and announced the band's reunion for a new tour. Tickets for the UK tour sold out in 30 minutes. The Police toured for over a year, starting in North America and going through Europe, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Their reunion tour was the third highest grossing tour of all time at the time of its conclusion. What is the secret of success? You should do it once and the timing should be right. Sting thinks. When the Police reunited, it had been long enough and it was the right time to do it. And I'm taking credit for that because that was my decision. Doing it again would just be gratuitous and that won't happen. But we did it, and everyone was happy that Mom and Dad got back together again and had one last fling. Sting is now 73 years old, but it doesn't look like he's about to retire. The last album to date was released in 2021, and in 2023 he toured the world with big concerts. By the way, his son, Joe Sumner, who followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a musician, went on tour with Sting. If you were a carpenter in the old days, because your dad was a carpenter and his dad before him, you would go into the family business, so it's not that unusual. If Joe wasn't any good, I wouldn't have him out on tour, but he is. And he's a dad himself now, and has a better understanding of me, because it's more like we're mates now than father and son. Of course, there were scandals. In January 2023, Sting gave a private concert for 50 top managers of Microsoft at the World Economic Forum. The very next day, the company announced plans to lay off 10,000 of its own employees, which seemed very dishonest. While some were listening to the concert of an expensive superstar, others were packing their own things and had to look for a new job. And although Sting long ago got rid of the image of a bad guy that grew to him in the 80s, from time to time he had to explain some of his actions. For example, in 2009, Sting performed in Uzbekistan, where according to some sources, he received £2 million from President Islam Karimov. This was in stark contrast to his past statements and positions, especially considering his attitude to the events in Chile. Speeches in front of dictators and billionaires, although they outraged part of society, could not overshadow his long and consistent charitable activities. Since the beginning of the 80s, when Sting had the first big money, he began to redirect it to charity. Creativity has been heard by millions, has become a powerful tool for conveying the right thoughts. As an example, we can mention the song of the 80s, Driven to Tears, which highlighted the problem of world hunger. In November 1984, Sting joined Band Aid, a charity supergroup made up mostly of the biggest British and Irish musicians of the era. This led to the Live Aid concert in July 1985 at Wembley Stadium, where Sting performed alongside Phil Collins and Dire Straits. We also know about Sting's love for tropical forests, the problem of which he takes care of to this day. Together with his wife, Sting founded the foundation to help save the Brazilian rainforest and protect the indigenous peoples who live there. His support continues and includes an annual benefit concert at Carnegie Hall that has featured performances by Billy Joel, Elton John, James Taylor, and others. For his dedication and efforts to save rainforests, a separate species of Colombian tree frog was named after Sting. Sting's last album to date was released in 2021 and was called The Bridge. This is quite a lively pop rock album written by a 70-year-old experienced musician, but the motive of the album is far from positive. Nevertheless, it was released during the period of the global pandemic and political upheavals, which affected the mood of the album. I didn't want to write about the pandemic, says Sting, but unconsciously I did because the concept of the bridge, music as a bridge between individuals, this is my connection with other people. I'm not much of a talker, but I can sing. Nevertheless, the album opens with a positive composition about love.
If it's love, you must surrender.
In addition, Sting says that working on the album helped him keep his sanity during self-isolation. Recalling that period, Sting admits that he quite enjoyed it because he got the opportunity to be with his wife and be in one place for more than one night. Apparently, they had never spent so much time together before. What is the secret of their long and strong marriage? According to the singer, their relationship is a real miracle, but they perceive it as if it could not be otherwise. We're friends. We love each other, but we actually like each other, and that's an important distinction there. Love is passion and all of that stuff, but actually liking somebody and enjoying somebody's company is something slightly different, and it lasts longer. So you can have both, and I think that's important. Be married to your best friend. For her part, his wife, Trudy, also treats her husband with great tenderness and respect. I'm married to an incredibly good husband and we're devoted to each other. She said, we laugh a lot. I think that's important in a marriage. He has my back. He's my champion. Obviously, there has to be a chemistry. That's why we can stay together for as long as we've been together. We have space apart because he tours and I go and do things that I have to do with my films. We don't live in each other's pockets. He and his wife now live in New York, but spend a lot of time at their estates in Tuscany and near Stonehenge. Besides creativity, Sting is engaged in winemaking, produces his own olive oil, makes cheese, grows vegetables and fruits. For Sting, winemaking is almost as important as music. In 1997, Sting and Trudy purchased a nearly ruined 16th century Tuscan villa south of Florence. It is 350 hectares of forest with vineyards and olive trees. Trudy's father was a farmer, so she took it upon herself to restore not only the villa, but also the depleted land that had long been neglected. The couple now produces about 150,000 bottles of wine a year. They consume responsibly. Youth is behind them, so the issue of health has become very important for Sting. The singer is so serious about the quality of food that his own nutritionist goes on tour with him and strictly monitors the singer's diet. No wonder Sting looks so good for his age. Undoubtedly, yoga also helps in this, as well as the fact that all bad habits remained in the distant 80s. I am fortunate in many respects, and having my health at this age is something that I don't take for granted. I've lost a lot of friends that didn't make it this far, and so I appreciate every day as it comes. All his children are grown up, have their own children, and live their own lives. The singer once called himself Serial Grandfather, and this nickname suits him perfectly because he has as many as 7 grandchildren. Despite the fact that Sting's albums bring him tens of millions every year and the fortune's about $500 million, none of his children are in the will. Sting told about this in one of his interviews. It's not that he doesn't love his children, it's just that he has always believed that they should achieve everything on their own. Of course, the singer adds that he would help them in trouble, but the children know about his beliefs and almost never ask him for anything. According to Sting, the secret to his long career is that he's still interested in exploring the field in which he works. I'm curious about music itself, he says. I'm still a student of music. I still practice every day. I still study. I sit at a piano or with a guitar, and I'm learning still. And I find things that I haven't found before. So you can't get to the end of it. That's the wonderful mystery of it, the enigma of music. But also, I'm willing to learn. So if that's why I'm still hanging on by my fingernails, then it's a good reason. Sting's story is a story of obsession with his work, for which he sacrificed comfort, friends, and love. Instead, he gained both comfort and love and his place in eternity. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. There are already many interesting stories on our channel, and even more are in development, so everyone will find something for themselves. That's all for today. You are watching the Enco Stories channel. We don't say goodbye for a long time, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.